So, welcome everyone here to the meeting and to this session. This is sort of an introductory, quick overview of what's happening in the antimicrobial resistance world that I've been involved in for quite a long time now, but very actively over the last 12-18 months. Just to let you know, I did this a year ago, looked at what's happened this week in antibiotic resistance and just sort of see what's happening. So around the world, there's nearly every week high-level meetings with different groups that are talking about this issue and making plans and issuing edicts and doing all sorts of things because it's being treated as and perceived, and we could talk about that as a global threat to human health because of the advancement of problems with treating resistance organisms in the human sector. Just looking down the bottom there, you know, there's 60 new peer-reviewed publications. I did the same thing a year ago. It was about the same. So if you wanted to read all the publications that came out on antibiotic resistance in a week, you'd pretty much be having a full-time job. Web postings were 18,000. But a year ago it was 421,000, and news items were 660, so it's a lot of news, but down. So I think we're getting a little bit of issue fatigue in the internet and in the news, but you can still see it is a highly discussed, high-profile issue. For 60 years ago, I graduated in 1975, and people were already debating about the role of antibiotics in animal use and resistance in human pathogens, and even back then the issue of growth promoting usage in particular was already a topical item, and pretty much few people argue that when we use antibiotics in any sector, we'll select for resistance, and we have done that in the animal sector, where the dispute is what the public health implications being. Some groups saying, well, yes, there's resistant organisms there, but the spillover rate is so low that the impact is low, and there's other people making the case, no, this is a major issue, we need to do things about it. And those groups have been at each other's throats probably for several decades, really. So in sort of introducing the discussion today, I think over the last 4 or 5 years, the philosophical approach to this issue has matured a little bit, and it's broadened a little bit, and people are moving towards more holistic sort of global approaches of trying to understand the phenomenon of risk in a sort of ecological context, rather than, so we find this in animals, we find this as human, you can or can't join the dots. So it's a much broader discussion. There's increasing breadth and depth of research, and what I'm getting at that, you know, many of you are familiar with the One Health idea that we're looking at human, animal, environmental health as a sort of integrated entity, and certainly one of our latest speakers is going to be discussing the issue of antibiotic resistance in the environment, which is an important piece of it, but there's looking at not only a broader picture, but we've got sharper tools these days in terms of what people can do from a research perspective with metagenomics, microbiomes, resistomes, whole genome sequencing, bioinformatics. The whole technological age is really bringing much more powerful tools to be able to look at, inform and understand us, and also confuse us with the amount of information surrounding this issue. So I'll be just talking through in the next few minutes, you know, some of the issues that are emerging that are, I guess, occupying the discussion a little bit in relation to animal use and resistance in humans, because they're the things that are directing the argument and where we go. I think a very obvious thing is, to me, when people start looking and getting new tools and looking things other ways, they see things and they report things, but those observations precede the understanding by a long way. So the example I'll use now, I'll come back to it, is the discovery of MRSA, methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, in swine in Europe and just about everywhere else since, you know, sets off a real panic wave and a lot of discussion before we really understand. It probably takes us 10 years to really get a handle on what the implications might be, but it takes about 10 seconds for the media and the globe to fill up with rumours and fear-mongering and everything else. So we're entering an area where there's broader research, there's more powerful research, but we still are facing that dilemma between the news comes out now and the understanding comes out in 5 and 10 years' time. And that creates a lot of issues for the animal industries because there's more finger-pointing potential. In today's climate, we're essentially guilty until proven innocent, which puts us as an industry in a perhaps a more pressurised environment than we've had in the past. I just want to refer to a paper here just to reflect this idea of the bigger picture looking at resistance, and Michelle will probably extend this further. This is a recent review paper looking at lessons from environmental antibiotic resistome and then putting in this sort of integrated thing that we've got soil, aquatic, atmospheric, animal associated, built ecosystems, and they're all home to microbes that harbour resistance elements and the means to mobilise them. Many of you are probably familiar with people going into pristine environments and Greenland ice cores and isolated caves and looking at soil or organisms they find and finding multiple resistance elements. They've been there for millennia. And that is nothing new, and that's why this issue of looking and discovering can sometimes be confusing. This paper makes a couple of comments. One is that the soil is the largest reservoir of resistant organisms because of its volume and the fact that resistance, even antibiotics produced by cell-borne organisms and the associated resistance elements have been there for millennia. And we have always this issue of, what is really the baseline resistome if we hadn't had the wave of antibiotic use in medicine, agriculture and other sectors. But again, the other point, antibiotic use has increased resistance in all of these reservoirs. And again, I'm really citing their comments to place a context on how the discussion is going. Other comments is that the diversity and abundance of resistance in the environment reflects, as I've said before, the ancient origins of antibiotics and its resistance. And the fact that we've failed to look at resistance as a product of evolution in all these niches, but over geological timeframes. Our focus has been on from 1950 on, whereas reality, the ecology of resistance at a global level is something that's been moving on. And as I mentioned before, the view that the industrialization of antibiotic production and use has created global selective pressures for amplifying resistance that hasn't been experienced in these millennia before. Now that we've created these products, we've used these products, we've introduced a selection pressure, and the challenge is really to understand the incremental effect that we've had on resistance in all of these sectors and in how they interrelate with one another. I now want to switch to a different paper, again to reflect some current findings, current opinions, and this is work done by Tim Johnson, who's at the University of Minnesota with some other international collaborators, and they were looking at, and Tim's an extremely talented molecular bacteriologist, and he studies resistance, particularly in plasmids and mobile elements and horizontal gene transfer, and they were studying clusters of antibiotic resistance genes that were in swine agriculture systems. This work was actually done largely in the Chinese sector, but we very often talk about tetracycline resistance or fluoroquinolone resistance as a bug and drug phenomenon, whereas it's increasingly appreciated that these resistant genes often hunt in packs. They're genetically linked in plasmids transposed into what they call mobile genetic elements, so that we have actually clusters of antibiotic resistance genes that are on the same genetic elements, and they move together as a pack, even though they encode resistance to different drugs. So some of the comments from the paper were that multiple drug-resistant organisms in this environment, which was swine production in China, are probably the norm rather than the exception. So that's typical that these multiple resistance elements will be associated. The same clusters or different clusters can be present in many bacterial taxa, so all of the sort of Berge's manual of organisms that might be in the animal's gut and skin, you can find these clusters in all of those settings. Another thing that is very, I think, clear in most people when they start researching this is that you find resistance elements there when the associated drug is not being used or has perhaps never been used. And so we have this disconnect between we're using drug X on this farm, but we're finding resistance to A, B, and C that may have never been used on this farm. And a lot of that can be driven by co-selection. Because these genes are riding together, if you're using any of the antibiotics that have a resistance encoding gene in a particular mobile genetic element, you will select for all of them. And so we can use tetracyclines and select for chloramphenicol resistance, even where we may not have used chloramphenicol for 40 years or more in the agricultural setting. So again, the co-selection is becoming more obvious that it's common and more problematic. And again, the comment from the paper at the end that managing this resistance reservoir is important for minimizing human use. So again, illustrations of recent research and the guiding philosophy of where the discussion's going. I just wanted to step back because one of the things Bob Morrison did, that whose life we're celebrating at this meeting, Bob would always, if you mentioned a word, he'd like to go back and say, where did that word come from? What does it really mean? And so I did that when we use the word reservoir of infection a lot. So I looked at, okay, what are we talking about? And the CDC's definition is it's a habitat where an agent normally lives, grows, and multiplies. Reservoirs can be humans, animals, or the environment. And this is the really key point here. Reservoirs may or may not be the source from which an agent is transferred to a host. An example, the largest reservoir of Clostridium botulinum causing botulism is in soil, but nearly all human botulism cases are linked to improperly canned food. So the soil is a very large reservoir. Canned food is a very small reservoir, but that's where most of the exposure comes from for the human population. So again, you can have a disconnect between the size of a reservoir and the importance of the reservoir because the agent has to have a mechanism of getting out of a reservoir. And so that's when we're looking at the food animal reservoir and finding multiple drug-resistant bacteria in food animal settings, the argument still remains, okay, what's the transmission potential from that reservoir? And that's where the debate tends to be long and sometimes bloody. I just wanted to put this up in terms of global terrestrial biomass, and this is some work done by a Canadian researcher trying to estimate, if we look at mammals on the planet, what have we got in terms of mass? And you can see livestock are the predominant proportion of global mammalian biomass, meaning there's a lot of livestock animals out there, a lot of intestinal tracts, and therefore a very large reservoir relative to humans and wild mammals. This is a slide that you may have seen before. So this is USDA NARMS data tracking multiple drug-resistant salmonella over almost a 20-year period. I'll point out a couple of lines. First of all, this dark line here is multiple drug-resistant salmonella from human clinical cases in the United States. So this is the national surveillance data. Everything else is variably samples from the animal sector, whether they be from slaughter plants, in some case retail food. The obvious thing is that you see when we're looking at salmonella in those sources of samples, generally multiple drug resistant are much more prevalent in the food animal reservoirs than in the human cases. So coming back to the point, we do use animal antibiotics in agriculture, and we observe an elevated prevalence of multiple drug-resistant bacteria. So we probably have created that through our practices. But the good news on this one is that if we look at multiple drug resistance in the human population, it's actually gone down over the last 20 years in US data and salmonella. And that why that happened, you can speculate, but one of the reasons is probably the regulatory changes in our meat inspection in the mid-1990s that have measurably improved the carcass contamination levels in all our meat industries. So if that's the explanation or not, but it certainly it would be consistent with the changes in the data. So it's not all bad news. The bad news is on this slide is on the reservoir level, we have high levels of multiple drug-resistant salmonella in our animal industries. The CDC, because we can talk about resistance as a sort of multi-headed monster and saying it's coming to get us without being specific, but really what's important is to understand at a public health level what are the organisms and what are the resistance determinants that are costing us in terms of public health burden. So the US, I won't go through this, the CDC in about 2014 said this is the list, this is the things that we think in the human population are really causing us pain and concern with respect to antimicrobial resistance. Push the button here. What I've done here is taken out all the things where no one realistically thinks the animal sector is playing a role. So multiple drug resistance, gonorrhea. No one's really sort of saying the problem here is what's going into chicken feed. It's a different thing. So these are the ones that remain. We can see they're drug-resistant Campylobacter and Salmonella. They're our primary foodborne pathogens, and we know that there's a contribution there. How much comes from the farm level, we can argue. The other ones are all important problems where at least they're on the table with respect to animals being potentially contributing to the problem. We could probably have a good half-hour discussion on each one of those and say, okay, what does the evidence look like? But what I'm really listening to here is saying these are the things that are on the table that we need to be having discussions about and thinking about. One that wasn't on the CDC list, but which I'll talk about quite a bit in a minute, is Clistin-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, because that emerged in 2015 as a global discussion item and still continues to be. So if we look back at what is actually driven the discussion, and by discussion here I'm talking about the concerns about animal antibiotic use in food animals contributing to human health problems. If we go back to the 1990s, what really started all was vancomycin-resistant enterococci in Europe, where they were using a growth promotant called avoparsin, which we've never used in North America. Also in the 90s, multiple drug-resistant salmonella, particularly this thing called Salmonella typhimurium DT104. It was coming to end Western civilization. It came, it was in multiple species, it was in the human sector, and no one knew why it came, and nobody knows why it has essentially gone away. But it was a very politically important concern. Fine, okay. I've got another list here in terms of ESBL enterobacteria, Mercy, and these other two, Clistin-resistant Enterobacteriaceae and carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And I'll just give you a little bit of detail about those because they're all things that are very much high-level concerns in the medical community and therefore to us. So just to refresh people, ESBLs are extended spectrum beta-lactamase bacteria, and it means that these bacteria produce enzymes that destroy beta-lactam antibiotics. So the prototype is penicillinase, but now there's drugs that destroy cephalosporins. And in Europe there was a lot of concern because they were finding particular isolates of E. coli in systemic diseases in humans, particularly urinary tract infections in women that were considered genetically identical to isolates from poultry. So we're saying here was finally the smoking gun. We have these isolates, the same sequence type, and a lot of genetic similarity to what was being found in people. They went to the next step and said, okay, let's do whole genome sequencing on these isolates. So look through a more powerful microscope, and guess what? They actually discovered that the organisms were phylogenetically distinct. So one level of greater scrutiny and more powerful testing says, aha, this is a problem, chickens are causing this. The next level said, well, actually, it appears we're wrong about that. But that hasn't filtered totally through in the conversation. So I've still been in meetings where people bring this up in chickens and ESBLs, even though it's pretty much a thing of the past. I'll skip over just for time the carbapenems. It's really just another type of beta-lactamase. And talk about the Clistin story, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. Colistin is a polymyxin antibiotic, and it's effective, highly effective against most gram-negatives. The downside for it in humans is it's highly toxic. So human medicine has essentially avoided this drug because of toxicity problems for the last 40 years. It's an old drug. It's a 1950s drug. But it's now become a last resort antibiotic when they're resistant to cephalosporins and carbapenems and everything else. The colistin has been brought out. Okay, it's toxic, but these people are going to die if they're not treated. Resistance is very rare in human bacteria and primarily chromosomal, meaning that historically we didn't think there was mobile genetic elements of colistin resistance going between bacteria. But the drug has been very, very widely used in livestock in Asia and in the European Union, both for therapeutic and for growth promoting purposes. We've never had the product in the US swine industry. There's only been one colistin product in food animals, which is an injectable poultry product, which, as you can imagine, hasn't been used very much. So essentially we're a colistin-free environment in our animal sector, but it has been widely used in other countries. The whole game changed in 2015 because a Chinese study reported colistin resistance in 20 to 25% of gram-negatives from pigs and poultry in China, and it was encoded by this gene called the MCI1 gene that was encoded on a plasmid and highly transferable. So first bad news, we have colistin resistance in the food animal sector. Second, it's not chromosomal, it's on a plasmid and it's a transferable plasmid. So the stage is set. This is the bushfire that's coming to get us. And subsequently people have looked and found, well, guess what? It's novel, but it's probably been there forever because we've discovered it in all sorts of places, including swine in the US. Retrospectively in Germany went back and did a survey of pigs from 2011 to 12 on old samples. 10% of the pig samples were positive, 25% of farms. So this gene had been there, but under the radar at relatively low prevalence in the German pig industry and in other European countries. Why does this MCR story matter a lot? And it matters because of the philosophical change. So there's a gentleman called Lance Price, who those of you who get involved in the politics of this will get to know him well. And this is what he's talking about, saying there can be, note the language, a vicious synergy of antibiotic use in animals and in humans where resistant bacteria can spill over to humans from livestock and ignite a blaze of resistant pathogens when medical antibiotic use is tried. And I used to joke, the real blaze had been going on in Lance's brain at that time. But the point is here, we can select for resistance in animal sectors. They can spill over at low levels and then be multiplied up when antibiotic use is high. And this colistin story fits into that narrative. And that's why it is perhaps a difficult one. And this is the other thing he said. Elevated antibiotic use on the farm can rapidly amplify resistance among human pathogens that find their way in the livestock. So they come to us, they pick up resistance, they go back, and that's been largely fueled by the story of livestock-associated MRSA. I'll probably skip through that one and just move on to this one because I've talked a little bit about carbapenem resistant being important, about the MCR gene. This paper has come out recently saying pigs can host multiple drug-resistant strains that have accumulated plasmid-mediated resistance against several last-line antibiotics. That's the conclusion, and it's a very troubling conclusion because it's saying these isolates from pigs, or isolate in the end, were resistant to carbapenems and resistant to colistin, which means you've run out of tools for treatment. I just wanted to point out the data in the study. They looked at nearly 8,000 isolates from a couple of thousand pigs, used selective medium, found 2 isolates that were positive for the carbapenem resistance gene, and one of them was positive for MCR. But the headline is that pigs can host these, not that 99.9% of pigs don't. And again, we get to this situation where people can look with these tools, they can find these genetic elements in the pig reservoir and in other reservoirs, and they can project the story that, the disaster is about to happen, where from a point of view of the size of the reservoir, it's very small. I know I'm running out of time. Chris, I'll just skip through these last slides. Because the other one that's driving the argument is the question of MRSA in the livestock sector. So this was recognised in the Netherlands in 2004. We know that people working in livestock, when the MRSA is there, are at very high risk of exposure and nasal carriage of the MRSA, and human clinical cases have been reported. Some have been serious. So this is not a zero-risk phenomenon. These bacteria are in the animal reservoir, they get transferred to humans, and you do get human illness. I'll skip through the US story. At the moment, as far as we know, we have relatively little MRSA, but we have MRSA in our swine industry, but less than in Europe. I just want to show you some slides from a friend of mine, Jan Dahl, in Denmark, where this is a high-profile issue in the pig industry. And these, briefly, won't take me long. These are incident human cases of MRSA in Denmark from 2001, and you can see this is total cases, and these are the livestock-associated cases. But here, these are infections and screening. And the thing to note is that they started screening people when they went to hospitals if they'd had pig contact, and a lot of this increase here is not infections, it's people carrying the organism. So you always got to look under the data to see what's going on. But they have looked further and looked at the clinical infection data. So what we have here is two things. First, the dark line is the prevalence of farms in Denmark that have the livestock-associated MRSA. You can see in a space of only 5 years going from not very much to essentially the entire industry, and concurrent with that you can see an increase in the numbers of cases of infections of livestock-associated MRSA in the Danish, and these are people who've not had contact with pigs, so it is spilt over out of the pig sector. 3 more slides. I still want to put it in context here. So this is a very bad news story, but if we look at Staph Aureus bacteremias in Denmark, this is what the total picture looks like. So this is all staphylococcal infections, and down here we have all the MRSA, and we have the livestock-associated ones, which are the CC398. You can see how small they are, and then if we look at it in terms of just those two, the MRSA and the livestock associated, you can see that most of them aren't livestock associated, but you do have this real number of infections that were pretty low. They actually constitute about 0.2% of staphylococcal bacteremias in Denmark. So Denmark is the worst case scenario. They've got a big pig population, a big swine population. They've got very good data to look at these trends, and they can say the public impact in the worst case scenario is still low, but it is still a politically hypercharged issue. So I know I've gone over here, but I just really wanted to cover this ground because this is very much a very political issue, and the scenario is likely to become more complicated rather than less complicated, and it's a full-time job just to try and keep your head around of the publication rate and the new scares. So I'll stop there.